Now that the USA has no president, the so-called religion of peace is launching massive terrorist attacks on the people of Israel. And the usual suspects, ignorant people, are spewing the usual claptrap about the poor Palestinians. So let's once again discuss who they are. There was a Facebook meme the other day that said, Palestine is the only country in the world that never existed before its occupation. Well, technically that's not true. The Romans used that term 2,000 years ago as a derogatory insult to the Jews living in that region. So the original Palestinians were the Jews under Roman occupation. Now, the people that we hear about in the news today as Palestinians were formerly known as Syrians, Jordanians, and Lebanese who were living and working in Israel. Shortly after Israel became a nation, Arab armies launched a massive attack on tiny Israel to wipe out the Jews. And to the utter amazement of the entire world, Israel, with a little help from God Almighty, stomped the living doggy-doo out of the Arabs, sending them fleeing back across the border like whipped puppy dogs. And the Arabs have been afraid of Israel ever since. So they came up with a new scheme to use the thousands of poor Arabs living in Israel as a political weapon to undermine Israel in the eyes of the world. The Syrians, Jordanians, and Lebanese living in Israel were renamed Palestinians and told to complain loudly to the entire world that Israel had stolen their land. And of course, flaming liberals all around the world jumped on that lie like chickens on a June bug. And poof, the Palestinians were a newly invented people, right there in the middle of Israel, to be a political thorn in Israel's side by constantly complaining that Israel is illegally occupying their land. That is false. History shows that Jerusalem has been the capital of the Jewish people for over 3,000 years. And to make things worse, the recently invented Palestinians serve as hosts for Hamas and other terrorist groups to regularly launch murderous attacks on Israeli citizens. Now, most of the so-called Palestinians are simply Arab people who live and work in Israel, and they enjoy the freedom and liberties that Israel guarantees to all their citizens. And the reason Israel is constantly in the news is because it is the focal point of a great spiritual battle that has been going on since the Garden of Eden. God and his holy angels against Satan, the devil, and his army of fallen angels. And as the final days of planet Earth approach, Israel will be the stage of the climactic battle that will result in the near total destruction of Earth and the second coming of Christ, who will defeat the forces of evil, restore the earth, and establish his rule. Until then, the Israel-Palestinian nonsense will continue, with the men and women of God standing with Israel and the men and women of Satan standing with the Palestinians. And yes, it's just that simple. This is Wild Bill for America. Thank you for watching, and America bless God again.